The genesis of the book was that I didn't have a relationship with my father for 14 years. I've often heard people say that people who hurt you, either you never talk about them or you talk about them all the time. And I used to never talk about my father because when I was growing up in the Chicago suburbs, he had shot and killed our neighbor. And he was a sort of an outlaw. And so after he shot and killed our neighbor, he bought himself a bulletproof vest. And he left, and he went back to Mexico and never came back. And so I used to never talk about him. But then eventually I went back to Mexico and reconnected with him. And when I went back down there, at that point I was already living in New York City, and he was in Mexico living on the old hacienda where both he and I had been born. And he had this 200-acre ranch, and I'd go and spend summers with him, and we would go out and herd cattle together. You know, like he would saddle up the horses at 4 a.m. and we'd ride out in the moonlight and go herd cattle together. And he, through that time that I started spending with him, he started sharing stories with me. You know, like we'd be riding past a creek and we'd ride past a tree, and he'd look at the tree and say, "Oh, that's where my brother Antonio and Fidel got into a shootout." And then he would tell me that whole story. And so it was, I think for me, because when I was growing up, I never understood him or never understood what made him tick. You know, like in the suburb, there's that saying, you can take the cowboy out of the mountains, but you can't take the mountains out of the cowboy, or whatever the saying goes. So with my father, when we were living in the Chicago suburbs, you know, often he'd come home from a night out, and before going to bed, he'd unload his gun in our front lawn. You know, it's just like he'd send 5 bullets into the front lawn, and then he'd go to bed. And so when we first moved to that suburb, the neighbors used to call the police and report that they had heard gunshots. But then eventually the neighbors got used to it, and it was just kind of like, oh, it's just, they were just kind of like, oh, it's just Jose turning in for the night, and didn't bother calling the police anymore.